Welcome back to the first day of the 2021 National Shared Mobility Summit. I'm Benji De La Peña. I'm the CEO of the Shared Use Mobility Center. We've got our exciting second key conversation for today. Let me stop for a moment and describe myself for our participants who are maybe visually impaired. I'm an Asian man with short hair, dark hair, wearing dark rimmed glasses and a white shirt. And I'm coming to you from the ancestral lands, the unceded land of the Duwamish and the coastal Salish. Our key conversation for this afternoon is all about, or we will hear from the people who are going to inherit this infrastructure that those of you might be able to see behind me, this massive sewers or highways for private transportation, which is unsustainable and unequitable. Our host is Juliet Eldred. She's a project manager at Trillium Transit, and she's the co-founder of that social media juggernaut, New Urbanist Memes for Transit-Oriented Teens, or otherwise known as NUMTOTS. And she's joined by three of her peers, Dave Sorrell, who's a Transportation Demand Management Administrator and Mobility Alternative Transportation Manager at the University of California, Berkeley, Jonathan Marty, who's a grad student in taking up his master's in urban planning in Columbia University, and Terrell Monroe, who is an operations manager for SPIN. I hand you over to Juliet.
All right. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to our panel today. I'm really excited to be here, and I'd like to thank the folks at the Shared Use Mobility Center, of course, for giving me the opportunity to host this panel.
And so I went to the West Coast, worked for transit agencies for less than a year. Then I went into the UC system, in which I'm overseeing our transportation program. So basically, it's just going from job to job to job, but most importantly, kind of paving my own way, because there wasn't really a right or wrong way to do it. Never mind that the school that I went to, Northern Illinois, wasn't necessarily a planning school whatsoever. It was known for local government. And so having to make pivots and then having to kind of find your own way, because you didn't really have the mentors and the mentees, or at least the communications possible. And as an introvert, that's twice as hard. You kind of have to make ways with what you have, as well as kind of seeing what's out there in the field and talking and meeting with new folks. And so right now I've got interns that, I can kind of blend with, work with, train, develop, and kind of get that notion that, you can create future leaders, especially if you're not the one that, had that same life experience.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Dave. Terrell, do you want to talk a little bit about your sort of background and how you got into the field and what
Sure.
Sure.
I'm Terrell Monroe. I'm the operations manager here at Spin Electric Scooters. I am a African-American male here on the screen with a white and blue pinstripe shirt with locks. And I have an orange background that says Spin. Hello to everyone. I started my career in transportation as an entrepreneur. In college, a couple friends and myself started a transportation company to transport college students back and forth home on the weekends. We were looking for students. Our niche were students that basically couldn't transport themselves, right? They didn't even have a car yet. They didn't have a carpool system set up yet, or their mom and dad just weren't going to come back to campus every weekend to get them home, right? So my friends and I thought of creating a bus route from the college that we went to out in Western Maryland, Frostburg State University, transporting students back and forth from the major cities to the urban areas. We grew that business to operate on 20 different campuses in 4 different states across the East Coast, right? How I got to where I am today, I actually went to a couple conferences and I completely fell in love with the micro mobility industry. And I made the decision to leave what I was doing and join Spin Electric Scooters. This was in 2019. So the scooter business was really young here in the DC area back in 2019. I started off as an operations lead, which was really managing the day-to-day operation and training the team. Now I was promoted back in 2020 as the operations manager, which is kind of taking a step back in managing the P&L. And I really owned all the hiring, the training, and the mentoring and the growth of our hourly workforce and getting them in a position to keep excelling in their career. In this industry, no day is the same, as we are still a really young industry and we're learning every day learning the infrastructure of the city, working with our city partners, working with our community to just build a way to move people freely around the city. I love what I do. And again, the most thing I love is no day is the same. So we're learning every day. That's my spiel.
Awesome. Also, I just realized I forgot to do an image description. I'll just do that for myself real quick. I am a white woman with brown hair and big clear glasses and red lipstick and a little button down. So that is what I appear to the world. And yeah, so it's Jonathan. Go ahead and give us your sort of little feel of your background experience. What sort of drove you to get into this realm?
Sure. Yes. Thank you, Juliet, for having me, and thank you to the Shared Use Mobility Center for having me. This is very exciting. Before I begin, I'm a younger white male with wearing a blue collared shirt, wearing like white Apple headphones. Yeah, so my interest in transportation begins at a very young age. I grew up in the an immediate inner ring suburb of New York City, which, despite being a railroad suburb, was relatively car centric. And I found that as I got older and spent far more time in the city, it was the thing that distinguished the two for me was that one was accessible by means of cheap and kind of user-friendly public transit, leading to like kind of a lifelong interest in the field. I eventually went to New York University for my undergraduate degree in urban studies. And there I found a really sort of thriving community of people who are working around transportation. There's the Rudin Center for Transportation Policy and Management. We had a lot of exciting people like Sarah Kaufman and Mitchell Moss working there and working on exciting projects, in these sort of emerging transportation sectors that were sort of redefining the streetscape of New York City. And yeah, moving forward, I mean, just in my various kind of internships and jobs in and around urban planning, I've found that, transportation seems to be the linchpin issue that binds together a lot of questions that, anyone who is interested in the city finds themselves asking, be that working at the Regional Plan Association and working on the Gateway infrastructure project, or the implementation of e-bikes or city bikes throughout New York City. It always seemed to be this common thread that tied a lot of other issues I was particularly passionate about together. And yeah, it's always a thrilling and interesting discipline to be in.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll give an extremely brief overview of my sort of background, and then we can sort of move on to the next topic. But yeah, like much like Jonathan, I grew up in New York City, and I was very much enthralled with the subway from a very young age. It's something that, like, even as a pretty young teenager, I was able to like go around places by myself. I never had to ask my parents for a ride. I could just go to record shopping and go all over the place by myself, and having that sort of level of freedom from a pretty young age was really transformative for me. And a lot of that was really sort of part of my drive, of course, realizing that most parts of this country it's impossible to have that sort of experience. And so ultimately, I think fundamentally everybody deserves, cheaper, if not free, safe, frequent, convenient, easy public transit and ways of getting from point A to point B. In terms of like actual career stuff, I studied geography in undergrad. And so as part of that, I learned GIS. And I remember early on in my GIS course, I went to this transportation, career networking event like for undergrads. And I remember talking to some of the people there who just started, they're like kind of early career professionals. They're like, I mentioned that I was doing GIS, and they're like, oh, we love GIS. We hire people, we need people who can make maps. We love it. And so I sort of realized in that moment, like, wait, I like doing this. I could get a job where I enjoy what I do. That's really cool. And so that was sort of a big moment. And I, in summer of 2016, I interned with USDOT in this really cool program they did called, my first of many ridiculous government acronym, STIPDIG, which stood for Summer Transportation Internship Program for Diverse Groups. And so it was as it said, an extremely diverse group of people, a lot of people from HBCUs, a lot of people in like community college. I was definitely not that many people from like Ivies and Ivy Pluses. And it was a really cool experience. I got to work in the Office of Spatial Analysis and Visualization, got to make some maps, meet a lot of people. And so that was sort of my, test drive for being like, all right, this is like what I want to do full time. And so originally I sort of approached it from like kind of the mapping and GIS angle, but over the past couple of years, I've kind of gotten a little more into the kind of policy aspects of transit. And I've been working, I've worked at a couple of different firms since I finished undergrad about 4 years ago. And now I'm working at a firm that does a lot of work with like GTFS, which is basically the feed mechanism that puts transit information into Google Maps. And so that's been a really cool experience as well in terms of thinking a lot about how people actually, user experience of getting on a bus and things like that. And a lot of those kind of aspects of data are very fundamental to the actual equity, all sorts of other important topics. So yeah, as far as so starting sort of thinking about the kind of full career trajectory, we can start off with first a discussion topic of really like breaking into the industry, recruiting, hiring practices, internships, things like that. So I will open the floor to y'all, and yeah, I guess I don't really have a specific question, more just what are your thoughts and experiences on these topics, and let's take it from there.
So I guess I can start off. Having done transit, just kind of as a reminder, I did start in like parking as an intern back in 2007, and so that that was one way of getting into the mobility space and doing local government type stuff during that week, or during that year or 3 years. And so I've had internships left and right, in which I've done a lot of background, or at least a lot of research into our public administration program. So it was kind of like going from taking what I knew about transit, or at least making the policy assumptions, writing policy papers, in college, realizing that, it's like, yeah, let's do local government, because at least I can be able to work with transit agencies, or at least try to address mobility solutions on a city scale, not so much regional scale, but that's neither here nor there. When I did the pivot, there was a temporary position that was open at Pace that I decided to take a shot at, because I was fun employed. We'll talk about the layoffs in a second, because being millennial old, the Great Recession of 2009 was a big reset for a lot of us then. It's a big big issue now, that's kind of translated to how we deal with hiring and retaining your employees, especially during the times of uncertainty. And over the course of like 10 years after the fact, it was a lot of like resume writing, getting to figure out, or at least look at your sites and seeing what websites have different positions open, being at the same job for about 6.5 years, knowing that I was going to relocate to the West Coast, that I had to like take a different shot at looking at different agencies, kind of looking at the backgrounds for that, for the folks that I was going to eventually serve, and then realizing that you got the job description, you do have a resume, but you also have to kind of combine those together. And when I'm looking at our employees now, because again 3 or 4 interns is different than your hourly employees and your salaried employees. However, at the same time, I look at both skills, but I also look at a desire to learn. You don't necessarily have to be a planner by trade. I'm not a planner by education, but rather through experience. And so if you're, my philosophy is, if you have, a willingness to learn and make a difference in the social good, regardless of your background, we can transfer those skills into something that's going to be good for you when you leave and when you make 7 figures out of Cal. And so it's kind of that, interesting approach to not only hiring, for skill sets that might not apply to the transportation realm, but maybe I can corrupt them enough that maybe they want to take a route that they didn't really think about. I've been successful at doing that a couple of times. And then also kind of instilling anti-racism behavior when it comes to transit planning and mobility planning, and making sure that we do have the funds and the availability and the knowledge and the strategic plan so that we can be able to execute effectively, because we have 40,000 students on our campus, and about 1/3 of them are on financial aid, and 1/3 of them are also dealing, with some kind of financial issue, as well as like communities of color and things along the nature of that. So we do want to be able to plan in the built environment, on a policy and in the practice front.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I think sort of one thing you brought there, I think we had mentioned at some point or another, sort of in the process of kind of prepping for this, was like the idea of like recruiting for skills that are or at least like kind of having a more open mind as far as kind of skills that people need to succeed in a job. Because like, I think sort of something, like that both me and Jonathan mentioned was that like, growing up in and around New York from a young age, like we're both very, taken with the system, and that definitely sort of experience of, being 16, 17 years old and going around and all over the city by myself and, taking the subway up to Bronx Science where I went to high school and then going out to Brooklyn for shows, things like that. And then dragging my friends with me on these adventures and having them, then of course having the realization that like this sort of knowledge and interest wasn't like intuitive or wasn't, an interest for other people was also sort of a thing that was interesting for me to realize. Like, wait, most people don't know like how exactly to get from like, the Upper West Side to Bushwick at 2 a.m. on a Saturday, things like that. So I do think that in that vein, like I think there's a lot of sort of knowledge that people have, whether it's, a desire to learn or kind of specific knowledge of like getting around a city, or just sort of the intuitive knowledge of like being in a space and knowing that how we move people is important. I think like that, obviously it can be hard to kind of read for and measure, I guess, but I think like those are the kinds of things that are important in, especially for like recruiting not only early career professionals, but also people who, recruiting from a very wide body of people, and not necessarily just people who have, masters in planning, or just people who, majored in urban studies or planning or anything. Like, I mean, I majored in an adjacent field of geography, but like I don't have a capital P planning degree. And so I think that's the case with a lot of people. And I think that's a good thing. Like, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for, getting your master's, but also there's a lot to be said for like having life bring you toward the field, because the nice about transportation is that it does cut across literally everything, and we all have to interface with the system in some way, shape, or form pretty much the moment we leave our homes. And so I do think that because of that, the field has sort of advantage in terms of being able to get a lot more people than in, say, a field where you need a lot more kind of advanced technical training to even consider breaking into it.
Yeah, studying a map when you're 3 or 4 obviously has gone a long way. And in Chicago, you've got 24-hour service on a lot of lines, and that's vastly different than what you see in the Bay Area, where most things probably shut down around 10 o'clock. So, you kind of have to plan ahead, but also kind of instill the knowledge of getting folks to where they need to go efficiently, effectively, as well as affordably.
For sure. Yeah, I guess that's sort of vein, Jonathan. I don't know if you had any. I mentioned this in sort of the outline, but as far as like your experiences with, you're currently getting your master's, like, do you have any sort of thoughts on that process and kind of how it may or may not affect kind of career stuff for you longer term?
Absolutely. Well, to both Dave and Juliet, your points, I think you're absolutely right that one of the many enjoyable and kind of wonderful things about this discipline is that it is interdisciplinary, and that it can kind of, people can be drawn to it from a variety of fields. And, speaking as the person, on the panel who's, currently a master's student, I will, easily concede, and I think this is a good thing, that having a master's in urban planning is not necessarily a prerequisite to working in transportation planning. I personally found myself towards the kind of academic route, the master's route, just in that I find that given how interdisciplinary planning and transportation planning and policy can be, I appreciate kind of being adjacent to the world of practice and kind of working as a researcher, because I find the two often bleed into one another. For instance, I mentioned working at RPA, where I was doing a lot of transportation policy work, and my former boss there, Tom Wright, was in fact one of my professors my first semester of grad school. And he was speaking about how he finds that with fields, particularly transportation planning, he finds it enjoyable to kind of have your to sort of like be spread out across the fields of like practice and academia and teaching, etc. But what is wonderful and enjoyable, and also kind of sometimes a little surprising for, I think, a lot of people, regardless of whether or not they pursue a master's in urban planning or something more specifically transportation oriented, is how much on-the-job training you end up having. Just inevitably, I find that most people, despite the sort of technical qualitative and quantitative skills that they teach you in planning school or in an undergraduate like urban studies or geography degree, you'll still find, inevitably, I've found in every position I've had, that a lot of the skills you learn are, on the job. You learn how to, read codes, you learn how to like kind of analyze networks a little bit differently than you may have been taught in school. So will happily concede that it's actually a wonderful thing that you do not need a master's. But also, in my opinion, a master's can help you kind of orient yourself. And particularly if you do not study something, that is, immediately relevant to the transportation planning field, then I think, it's certainly worth pursuing just to pick up some helpful and meaningful skills there.
Mhm. Very good. Yeah. I think one sort of other topic I wanted to kind of mention on this, while we're sort of on this vein before we sort of switch to the next one, is so we sort of talked about internships a little bit. And one thing, I do think transportation is a little better than some other industries in terms of like offering paid internships. Like at least the program that I did, SNPDIG, was fully paid, and they also paid for our housing, which ruled. It was great. And so I think that, but that is, I think, more likely to be the exception than the rule. And so I think like this is more of just a thing that I just would like to use this platform to say, which is pay your interns. And if you can't pay them $15 an hour, you shouldn't have an intern. Like that's just, frankly, that is my thought on it. Like this includes college credit doesn't count, because they're still paying college tuition at that point. Let them take classes for college credit, and then give people money if they're going to do work for you. Like that's just sort of, I'm not a capitalist by any means, but if you're someone to do work for you, you should pay them. I think that should be pretty simple. So just putting that out there. But I do think that like as with the program that I did, I do think paid internships are a huge part of recruitment, because number one, unpaid internships require you to either take on another job, which may not be possible if there's a lot of time commitments, or it just requires you to have independent money and support, which is not accessible to everybody. And so, paying people like an actual wage for their labor definitely just seems like a pretty easy and almost like too obvious way to just like broaden your recruitment pipeline. And so that's just sort of a thought that I had and wanted to put that there.
One thought that I have, just to reiterate what Jonathan mentioned, is from the operational component, you have to be willing to really like humble yourself and like actually like get in the field and get on the ground training at a granular level. I know when I started like my first month as an operations lead, like I really wanted to be like in a van. If you don't know what we do, we kind of deploy and move scooters around the city. So I actually got in the van with our drivers, learning from them, actually putting a scooter on the corner or getting a scooter back into the warehouse, rolling up your sleeves, getting your hands dirty. You have to be willing to do that actually. Absolutely. To like kind of break into the industry, because you really don't understand what your hourly workforce go through when they're out in the field and you're sitting back in your office. So if you're willing to do that, you'll really get a great perspective of what's going on actually in the field. So that will kind of facilitate the decisions you make on a day-to-day basis. So if you're willing to get out in the field, you'll be much more better off. Definitely.
Yeah. And just kind of going from that, even in transit planning, there's this notion that there's a disconnect between planning and operations, whether or not they are, self-inflicted because of silos and the way that folks communicate and big egos and whatnot. One of the things that I did was ride the system. When I moved out here to the Bay Area, I was an operations planner. I got out into the field because I needed to know how each system worked, how my routes worked, and for a countywide transit system that has other issues, it was like, well, how can I be able to fix the problems so that I can solve for the problems? My management didn't agree with that. And, that led to issues down the line. And, that's kind of respective of old school versus new school. That's my background in, public management, as well as organizational development, which was basically a business degree, MBA minus accounting, which was probably for the best. But, when it comes down to offering, these positions, it helps to work with your, operations staff and to kind of figure out what do they experience from their day to day? Like, how can we be able to bridge that gap? How can we make our services a lot more effective, especially when you deal with buy-in with your employees down the line? So, just getting that understanding. You may not have a CDL to drive a bus, but if you're able to have that communication, it goes a long way. And just to kind of mention what Juliet says, as a department head, like I remember growing up, I didn't have all the internships I've had were paid, only because of the fact that I was self-sufficient at a relatively young age. And so I wasn't going to go through, health and body, risk that for a unpaid internship that probably won't amount to much, or, you don't have the bandwidth to actually take on some schoolwork and things like that. So with that in mind, I keep knowing that, living in the Bay Area is not cheap and it's not pretty. So you have to kind of make do, but as a department head, I tell my interns, hey, you do work, I need to pay you that, and you need to be paid for what your worth is. And so it's kind of instilling that knowledge in them. It's like, hey, get paid what you deserve because you are actually worth it. You're smarter than me. Go for it. Go for it. You should be paid, the equivalent of what you're doing.
Exactly. Yes, I'm definitely glad that I think culturally as a whole, I feel like the notion of like, you have to like grind unpaid until you make it. I feel like that is starting to be less of a thing as people started to more really kind of as a society collectively realize like, wait, like unpaid internships are bad for many, many, many reasons, especially if they're, for-profit companies or like larger public agencies or entities. And and so I think that if you have the opportunity to, have an internship and also, not only make it paid, but also like give your intern like meaningful work to do. Because it's like, I do think that doing some grunt work, I think, is an important experience for everybody. Like even at my current job now, there's times where I have to just like, do what I call advanced copy pasting in terms of like data management, things like that. So I do think that kind of experience is useful in terms of like really getting into the weeds. Like that's sort of like the kind of office equivalent of, going out there with your drivers in the truck and all of that. I do think a lot of that is important, but also I do think that like, giving your interns opportunities to like really learn and like really sit down on meetings. Like that was one thing I really appreciated about my time at USDOT is like my boss would take me to meetings with her. And there's definitely a couple times where she sort of would give me her like, her kind of career trajectory background, like her experience and to talk to me about like potential options for the future and all of that. Like, unfortunately, like I got this internship in summer 2016. So right at the very end of the Obama administration and right when I was graduating college, I wasn't exactly keen on diving right into federal level public service for obvious reasons. But on the whole, though, just like having somebody like that was extremely good for me. And so I feel like that, if you are somebody who's in, let's say some mid-career or higher position, and you have the opportunity to, whether it is to have or a paid internship or at least provide some sort of informal mentorship, I do think that is really important. Like especially not only for people who are like already hired by your org, but if there are people that of your broader network who could be interested, might be interested, like kind of keeping your sort of feelers out there for people. And I remember in undergrad especially, like if anybody, I definitely tried to like recruit people to the geography major and like convince them all to take GIS and stuff, but I succeeded in a couple of cases, and that was always kind of cool to just sort of see various people. It's like, oh yeah, you're doing this too now, welcome to the club. And so that's just sort of a good feeling, and I do think that is important. Yeah, I think now we've reached about 25 minutes left or so. I'm going to switch to kind of switch topics a little bit. So of course, if we're going through this sort of career trajectory, we're starting, getting into the field, internships, et cetera, et cetera. And now we get to sort of the point of like what happens when your career sort of suddenly ends. And so this means I'm going to talk about layoffs and things like that a little bit. And so, due to COVID, a lot of, millions of Americans faced layoffs, furloughs, and like reduced work hours. And unfortunately, transportation was no different. So I was laid off in May of 2020. I'm going to tell a brief story about my experience with that, just because I think that it is worth talking about these things. So basically, I was laid off my previous job in May of 2020, along with 19 of my other coworkers after I'd been there for about 9 months. We were given 3 days of notice. Basically, they told us on a Wednesday, and that Friday was our last day. And then I got 1 week of severance pay. And frankly, the whole thing was pretty emotionally devastating on a lot of levels. Because beyond losing what I thought at the time was like my dream job, there's definitely a lot of kind of whiplash I felt of, just a couple of days prior, higher ups being like, oh, we love working with you. We're so glad you're here. There's so much potential. And then it's just like, enjoy your $736 COBRA payment, like have fun. It's a pandemic, like that was just very jarring to me on a lot of levels. And I was, really fortunate. I was able to benefit from enhanced pandemic unemployment aid, thank God for COVID bucks. That was great. And, I also had a very supportive network of family and friends who were able to make sure I landed on my feet again. And after about 3 months, I was able to get another job in the field. So ultimately, I ended up pretty much all right. But, those 3 months were very uncertain, very chaotic. And there's definitely a lot of times where I was worried that, what if I couldn't get back in the field? What if my career was just over before it started and I had to switch? There's a lot of sort of fear around that. And so the reason basically that I'm sharing all of this is that generally at kind of larger conferences, the speakers are the kinds of people who are more likely to be making the call to lay people off or not, rather than the ones who actually bear the consequences of that decision. And ultimately, in the case of my former employer, they chose to prioritize the fiscal health of the firm over the continued employment of the 20 of us. And, my story is just one of the many human costs of doing so. And I was fortunate that I managed to get out of it largely unscathed, but that's not the case for a lot of people. And so that's sort of my own experience with that. I just felt like these things are important to bring up because I know that a lot of places, especially in sort of private sector or kind of private sector adjacent, had to deal with this in the last year or so. And I do think that kind of bringing up kind of experience of actually kind of dealing with sort of uncertainty is a valuable one, and one that's not, when it comes to things like equity, one that not always doesn't always come up all that much. But yeah, Dave, I think you mentioned that you had some similar experiences at a point in early in your career as well. So I was curious if you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah. So thank you, Juliet. Eons ago, 2009, I was an intern out in local government, and it came down to, paying an intern $15 an hour, which in 2009, that was a lot of money for 23-year-old at the time, or, kind of maintaining community service officers for this one suburban village. They chose the CSO officers. I'm not bitter or anything like that. The commute was just treacherous. However, knowing that, you were unemployed for 110 days, jobs were bleeding left and right, budgets in local governments were cut and slashed almost on a wild level. And so it became kind of this numbers game, and it kind of just threw my confidence out for a loop because I didn't think that I was capable, or didn't have the knowledge enough to actually try for it. That's how I got the PACE position, because I looked every day, tracked a whole bunch of different jobs. Fast forward 11 years, 2020. My unit is funded by parking revenue at a university. A lot of folks have this argument that parking should be free at universities. No, because that's a completely different paradigm argument that, we can probably chat over beer with. However, with that in mind, we lost 95, a good chunk, about 90% of our revenue. That meant that a lot of folks, we've had our union staff laid off to some degree. We've maintained, and we already run a lean organization. I had to fight to keep 3 of my interns through this entire pandemic. And, that required me, running to get grants, knowing that interns at $16 an hour, those aren't necessarily cheap, but at the same time, we have this objective, and it's a strategic objective. Be hireable when you leave, because I had a couple of seniors under my realm. Make sure that, we have this, this obsession of return to campus. And so they've done a really good job with a lot of the stuff that we've been kind of building up. So they had skills that I didn't have that I would need, because otherwise we'd be, in trouble. But also understanding too that, it is hard, and in just having that lived experience, some folks are a little more luckier than I am, but having that lived experience and having like semesters from hell, and then knowing that these students have been grinding for 3 months. It's Cal, so you have to be at the top of your game. It's drawing folks down. And so it's kind of like, I need to be more empathetic as a manager, because you're going through all these challenges. I'll keep you as long as you do your best, as long as we kind of communicate, what do you need from me? What do I need from you? As well as having this understanding that, we're a team. We're going to go through this together. With our union staff, like our cashiers, our enforcement, I check in on them a lot, even though they're not my direct reports, because that's part of a larger family. Like, I care about these guys, because I'm the youngest department head that we've got, and yet I still want to make sure everyone's cool, even though they're older than me. Like, it's, hey, what can I do to help? How can I be able to kind of work through whatever challenges that you're going through?
Awesome.
We had similar experience with the pandemic here. When the pandemic hit, we were actually in the process of scaling. And when the pandemic hit, we had to kind of cut almost 60% of our workforce. Due to the demand components, is people weren't comfortable with being outside. Everybody was quarantined, so no one was kind of using the service. But one of the things that we were able to do is luckily, because we are backed by Ford, we were able to put together a pretty good package of a 12-week compensation package. So we were able to get everybody's paychecks out for 12 weeks until we had to actually put them on severance. But one key component that we were able to convert on is just be completely transparent through the entire process, right? And continue to communicate with our team. And then we try to find ways to scale within the pandemic. And one of the things we were able to do to allow us to continue to scale was, fortunately, we were labeled as an essential service. Our mayor here in DC thought it would be more beneficial, instead of having people on the metro buses or in the metro trains, it makes more sense to put one person per scooter. So, and we created some programs built around that, as far as getting our essential workers back and forth to work. And we were able to continue to scale doing that, because they took a number of trips that we gave to essential workers. If you were able to hit different milestones, you were able to increase your fleet. And that's the name of the scooter game, is basically to get the biggest fleet. So as we gave back to the community, that allowed us to scale. And the first thing we did was calling back those workforce, like calling back those guys. Hey, let's get you back on the schedule. Let's get you back on the schedule. Let's get you back on the schedule. Although we had limited hours that we were able to allocate, because the demand component was still low, we were able to retain, maybe of the 60% that we laid off, we were able to get back half of those guys. And the other half basically found other opportunities. But one thing I learned was just be completely transparent through the entire situation. And everybody understands what the pandemic did to our economy. So being transparent and letting them be a voice, giving them the opportunity to give ideas and how can they help, if they could, work from home or do whatever they can do, letting them having that voice. And just transparency was key for us. And it really made that situation, although it was hard for a lot of people, it really softened the blow.
For sure. Yeah, I think that's definitely a really big part of it. Because one thing that also happened with me my layoff, and I found out a couple months afterwards that my old company had basically relisted my position and no one told me. I only found out because somebody had emailed me, an acquaintance, oh, I know you worked at this company, can you tell me more about it? And then I was just like, oh, looks like they're hiring for someone else. And it's it's one of the things, at that point I'd already, gotten my current job, which is actually a nice salary increase. So I have no complaints there. So it worked out fine ultimately. But it's one of those moments where I was just kind of you could have at least given me a heads up. I don't know, so those kinds of things. So I do appreciate that, that is something that you kept under consideration during that, because of course it meant that, people were forced to make a lot of trade-offs, a lot of them not great. And yeah, but at least I think that it's at least you owe to your workforce is to, be totally forthright with them about various things that are happening and why they're happening and all of that. Yeah, so I think we're getting to the last 15 or so minutes. Let's see if there's anything else before we kind of go to the wrap-up question. I guess one other thing also that I think is worth mentioning is, as I mentioned earlier, my severance when I got laid off was I got 1 week of severance pay, and I think it was done according to seniority. I was pretty junior at the time, so I didn't get a ton. 1 week is not very much. And, most of my understanding is most sort of white collar employees that such a lot in private companies, transportation have not unionized. That's not a thing that I know of really yet. If you are, please talk to me. I would love to be in touch. But anyway, I do think that had I, had a union backing me, it's very likely I probably could have, they probably wouldn't have stopped the layoff, but I probably could have gotten, maybe a little more severance or other sorts of things like that. And so I think that given that probably the big, most high profile fights about this sort of topic are, more recently in California, things like Prop 22, where a lot of the rideshare companies fought very hard to make it so that their drivers would not be classified as full employees. I do think that ultimately, especially really any industry, if your employees try to unionize, one of the best things you can do is just voluntarily recognize it, because ultimately what it means is they have a stake in the company and they want it to be good too. And so when people have more of a voice, they're more likely to actually be engaged with things, and not and antagonizing people more about that is generally not good practice. So that's my sort of other thought on that topic. So I guess now it seems like a good time to migrate to a kind of wrap-up question, which is being here, as the individuals who are going to inherit this transportation system and everything that is built over the next couple of decades, how do the people who run these organizations now, how can they enable, the next generation to really thrive? This is, big, wide open-ended question. And so, yeah, curious as to y'all's thoughts on that.
Yeah, and there was also this question that was posed there. So I'm going to actually transpose
Okay,
both
yeah.
your question and the Q&A, because, again, without being too academic about it, Douglas McGregor talks about theory X and theory Y, which is basically the notion of involvement in motivation when it comes to actually training your employees. And your theory X folks kind of operate on a sphere of fear, versus theory Y employees, which is more of a not self-interested, but they understand the system, but also want to improve the system, so they're self-motivated. Then you've got theory Z, which is relatively new, which focuses on the company culture. What I found out when I started was that there were a lot of folks that are really old school. Me, being millennial old, didn't necessarily fully agree with it, but I understood. Being in my position, you kind of know both sides of the equation, where younger generations, they have, a hierarchy of needs similar to Maslow. And then old school employees have this, most old school employees, I'm not going to categorize those folks either, that operate on a level of, okay, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's like, hey, you can always do better. And I'm very fortunate that I had department heads at Pace. A couple of them have passed on recently that have made a lot of impact on my life on how can we be able to actually provide the the culture necessary for growth and development. And so, when you're looking at your future employees, what I tend to think of is company culture, improving that so that you can be able to actually be flexible while doing your same job. Practicing anti-racism efforts in planning and transportation and development and the whole 9 yards, because that's the other thing from what we've learned in 2020 was that our built environment is very racially incapable of handling how do neighborhoods interact with each other. From scooters to buses to bike share, like everyone has a role in improving that, both inside and out, engagement and strategy. Looking at anti-bias training. This is something that is being pushed through the UC system when it comes to management and senior management, when it comes to the hiring of your employees. Like, you have to come in with an open mind, as well as kind of avoiding those types of questions. Professional development, like taking advantage of, say, LinkedIn courses, doing grad school. I did a couple certificate programs, throughout my career that kind of helped me, develop the background, but also just to plant my skills. So public transit management, I've done 2 sessions of those. Supervisor training, I've also done sustainability training, because I don't know a darn thing about sustainability when it comes to the data necessary, but those things are manageable. And then looking at yourself internally and doing, like, say, Strengths Finder, in which I use with my staff, because the only way that we can be able to kind of make sure that I'm applying the right things so that they can thrive, my employees can thrive, they can also kind of use it to their advantage when, they're looking at senior year, wanting to apply to all the jobs in the world. And, we want to make sure that they've got the tools ready to go. And so it's kind of like building up a great farm, quote unquote, baseball term, a farm system of great interns, and making sure that they can do the right positions and making sure that they would want to do what they want to do, as opposed to just coming in and only for a paycheck. That's just the long and short of it.
Yeah, I guess.
I'm sorry. One comment I would like to make, and this actually comes from the Q&A, also, is if you feel stuck in the position, what can you do? But also, as we inherit this transportation system, speaking from the micromobility side, speaking from the scooter component, I mean, we're still so young and there's still so much to learn in our sector. And what I preach to my team that's underneath me is, some of the issues that we have, you see it every day. Be fearless, actually carve out that issue and just chip away at that issue to come up with solutions to those issues. Especially being on the ground level. If you are able to identify the issue, propose a solution to it, and actually implement that, and then find a way to scale that, that will really catapult your career. Just a couple of examples. We had here at Spin, we had the opportunity to launch Spin Hubs, which are basically docking stations for scooters, right? We had no idea what we were going to do with them once we had them kind of thrown in on it from HQ. But once we did launch that, I had the opportunity to actually launch it here in DC, and we launched it. And I just basically focused on that like 100% of my time. I focused in on that. I learned about it. I saw the problems. I came with solutions, and then I was able to document those solutions and find a way to scale it across the company, right? And then from there, they actually like opened up departments just for what we were trying to solve for. And then that opened up so many job opportunities. Now we have like a full hourly workforce just for some of the problems that I found. So one thing I would say is just basically identify problems, find solutions, and being able to scale those solutions will make a huge impact on how fast you grow.
Yeah, I think sort of kind of building off of what you said, Terrell, and also Dave, and also sort of thinking more broadly about like kind of, you know, not only like recruiting people, but sort of keeping people in is like, not only do you want to like kind of bring in young people, the next generation, but you want to like keep them there and the best way to do that is to like actually listen to them and like meaningfully deal with that. Because definitely sort of an issue, especially with a lot of kind of more entrenched entities, is like, you know, as Dave said, there's definitely, you know, the old guard, and then there's sort of the younger, newer people. And so there's definitely sort of an inherent tension to that. But and there's definitely kind of, you know, status quo bias is extremely strong. It's much easier to just keep doing things as you always do than it is to try something new, because, you know, what is new could potentially be bad and scary, but also could be amazing and great. And so I do think that like one great way to sort of keep people longer term, and also just like make them feel more invested in their sort of workspace as a whole, is to like give them space to, you know, share their thoughts, and also make it like safe for them to, you know, express dissent basically, and make it clear that like if you disagree with a certain policy, like we're not going to immediately fire you, you know, like, or not going to, you know, because yeah, definitely, you know, I've not personally dealt with this, but I know kind of in many places, especially where there's sort of a lot more entrenched old guard, there definitely could be a bit of, you know, culture of fear, or being like, you know, only any sort of like kind of suggestions to how to improve things, or maybe, you know, shut down, or and the people who bring them up could be, you know, punished in whatever shape that may take, whether it means being demoted or, you know, in any case, the goal ultimately, if you want to kind of keep people longer term and keep them invested, it's like you want to give people opportunities to actually bring them in and identify when things aren't working, and also make it clear that you actually value their opinion. Because the problem too that can sometimes happen is like those places where it's like, oh, we've noticed there's an issue, we've, you know, created a staff survey, and then they do nothing to the results of the survey, or they get the results and they don't implement anything, and then they wonder why people are unhappy. Things like that, where it's just like, you know, if you want to actually keep people around long term, you have to not only listen to them, but show that, you know, walk the walk and show that you have done that. It doesn't mean you have everything, but that's big, can go a long way.
Yeah, and the other thing too is don't be afraid to ask for more money. Like don't be afraid to ask for better benefits. Don't be afraid to search for other positions if you're not happy with the situation that you have. Like always level up. Don't be complacent. You know, we don't talk about this often, but you know, some public sector employees have the benefit of a pension. You know, you should always save up because you never know what's going to happen. But, you know, the benefit of being a public sector employee sometimes is that you could very well diversify and have not only a 401k, but also a pension, or in some cases, not to really call myself out, 2 different pensions if you vest out and hit your marks. So, you know, think about what you want to do ahead when you grow up. I use that because I'm still trying to figure that out, but also realize that, you know, if you're going to raise a family, you know, like don't be afraid to ask for what you want. And if you're not happy with that, also don't be afraid to explore elsewhere, because, you know, as managers, you know, given budgets and all that stuff, you want to be, you know, as proactive as possible. And it is a two-way street. Like I expect, you know, X and Y from my employees, but my employees want Z, A, B, and D, and let me try to meet them halfway for that. Like managers should have that open mind and the open space to be able to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think one other thought I sort of had that sort of ties back to stuff I talked about earlier is like because, we're all sort of here really because we care about this stuff on some level beyond just getting a paycheck. Like, we all are invested in transportation. We all want mobility and all this to be better. And this is one thing I realized in my experience of being laid off and all of that is like my loyalties to my field and not to my job necessarily, in the way of like, it can be very, because of course, the two are very closely linked. Like, I mean, obviously, I've had the privilege of working in transportation, so my career and my sort of passion are at least somewhat tied, even if, the actual day-to-day is not necessarily 100% what I want to do all the time. But in any case, I do think that that can be a sort of important thing to remember, especially when it comes to work and labor stuff, is like, ultimately, we're here because we care about transportation, not necessarily because we get our paycheck from company Y or company Z. And so ultimately, if company Q has better options for you, take them, do it. Like, you want to, because unfortunately under capitalism, we are sort of at the mercy of all these things. And so if you can find somewhere that, is giving you what you want when your current company won't give it to you, leave, get the money, get the benefits, whatever it may be. And so I do think that that is sort of an important, thing to remember as well. And yeah, I guess that probably means, I think we're about at time. So yeah.
Well, Juliet and Dave and Terrell and Jonathan, thank you so much for a really great conversation. Thank you for reminding us that if we're going to work at making that thing more equitable, it has to start at home. It has to start with the organizations we run and we participate in. And I hope all of you who have some responsibility in your organization heard that. There's an additional burden, right? At least the federal numbers is that there are double the number of federal employees above the age of 60 than there are under 30, right? And so that whole workforce is aging. It needs to be replaced by younger people who are committed to a very different future. So thank you so much, Juliet, Dave, and Terrell for joining, and Jonathan for joining us.